to Music History 1, Chapter 8 video lecture, England and Burgundy in the 15th century. 15th century, of course, meaning 1400s, the first part of the Renaissance. So, it's kind of streamlining things a little bit. England and continental Europe did not always culturally influence each other. Even today, they don't always culturally influence each other. But during this period of time, we do begin to see some crossing of the channel, if you will, of ideas. So, probably the most influential English form of music at the outset of the Renaissance was the carol. Carol was polyphonic. It was a religious song in either Latin or English, because remember, at this point, still Roman Catholic Church controlled most of Europe, and Latin was the language of religion, and Latin was the language of the educated person for the most part. That's where most of the writing and things were still in Latin, formal writing. Favorite topics of the carol were Christmas and the Virgin Mary. This is probably where we get the term Christmas carol from. Solo and choral sections alternate. If you think of all the way back in chapter 3, we're talking about Gregorian chant, and you can have antiphonal, where two sections of the choir alternate. You can have direct, where everyone sings it all the way through, and then you also have responsorial, where a soloist alternates with the choir. So you can think of this as being almost responsorial in the way it's crafted. The stanzas were all set to the same music. I mean, once you take a second to think, what form is it when the stanzas, every stanza is set to the same music? I'll give you 3 seconds. Did you get it? It's known as, it's not through composed, and it's not modified strophic, it's strophic. Strophic is the form when all stanzas are set to the same music. Now, the refrain, the chorus, we would probably call it today, was called the burden. This led actually to a specific kind of musical craft called the fa burden. Fa burden was actually improvised polyphony, where you sang the chant in the middle voice, tenor, called cantus firmus. Their upper voice sang a perfect fourth above, and the lower voice sang a third below, and we moved in parallel. So this was polyphonic, much in the style of post-Notre Dame organum, but it was improvised. It was used by monks who were unable to read music. They couldn't read music, but they could still sing polyphony by improvising the chant in the middle voice, upper voice a fourth above, lower voice singing in thirds below. So this is a little clip of music. We're going to listen to a carol in class. It is anonymous. We don't have a composer for it. It's titled Alleluia, a New Work. It's really a beautiful carol. I like it a lot. Now, in the first part of the Renaissance, the most important English composer was John Dunstable. Dunstable, incredibly influential, and when you read the writings of the time, he is usually the composer that is pointed out as being the most influential to composers on continental Europe. He wrote over 60 major works that have survived to this day that we know about. Settings of the Mass Ordinary, we'll get to that in a moment. Isorhythmic motets, and over 20 other Latin sacred works. In class, we will listen to his motet, Quam Potra Ace. It is not based on a pre-existing melody. The 3 voices are nearly equal in importance. Remember, we were talking about our overview of the Renaissance, how we go from 3 voices to 4 voices. Well, this is still in 3 voices. But the voices eventually achieve equal importance instead of the one voice that was singing the cantus firmus being more important than any other voice. So this is not based on a pre-existing melody. So all 3 voices can be similar in their importance. It's homorhythmic, homorhythmic meaning they're all moving at exactly the same time, which functionally really creates a bit of a more of a homophonic texture. The form, unlike music that perhaps follows the fixed forms of the day, is based on the phrases and the text. So he modifies the music Now, the vertical sonorities are consonant. I want you to think about that for a second. Up to this point, they start with a pre-existing melody, and then they compose their organum, their duplum, their triplum above it in free organum. But the music is really conceived of more linearly, where they're thinking of the melodies and not quite so much as to how the chords stack up, although, of course, they do have to avoid the dreaded tritone. This is conceived of a little more so that when the voices stack, these sonorities are more consonant. So, moving forward, and we will listen to that in class, as I said, and we'll break down the score a little bit. The motet, when we first started talking about the motet back in the latter part of the Middle Ages, from the French word mot, meaning word, it basically meant any work that had texted voices above a cantus firmus. Now, it starts to get a little more specific. Remember the isorhythmic motet, where the isorhythm was the repeating, the talia, the repeating rhythmic figure. Eventually, the isorhythmic motet goes out of style. It disappears by the first part of the Renaissance. Eventually, the word motet, the isorhythmic motet, disappears. The word motet came to mean pretty much any polyphonic composition that is Latin, and it also came to mean any Latin text, including the Mass proper or any of the offices, your Vespers, your Laudes. Eventually, the meaning of motet changes even a little bit more, but that's where we are now in Dunstable's time. So, we will listen to some music by Dunstable, we will listen to a carol in class. That's the English music that was crossing the channel and influencing what was going on in continental Europe. In Europe, it really all starts in this time with the Duchy of Burgundy. Burgundy, now, a duchy is basically an area of land that is controlled and ruled by a duke. The Duchy of Burgundy was a very large area in northern Europe, and if we break it down, there is a map I'll show you. If we were to break it down, we'll see that it actually contained Holland, Belgium, and part of France, so it was a very large chunk of real estate. Most of the musicians, famous musicians this time, came from Flanders and the Low Countries, as Belgium and the Netherlands are known as the Low Countries, so below sea level, actually. In 1477, the duchy was absorbed by the French king and instead became a vassal of the King of France. In the 1400s, these courts of the nobility had many visitors coming from other countries to them. So basically, the Burgundian court, the court of the Duke, of the Duchy of the Duke of Burgundy, was wealthy, it was important, and a lot of people came to visit it, meaning that they would listen to the musicians at the court and be influenced, and they would go back to their home courts of wherever they were from, and they would want to hear music, the type of which they heard coming out of Burgundy. This made Burgundian musicians among the most influential musicians in all of Europe in the first part of the Renaissance. I don't know how well you can see this map on the video. We can put it up during class, but this shows you basically the Duchy of Burgundy over various times, spreading out from 1363 all the way through 1477, when eventually Burgundy, as I said, became a vassal of the French king. So, the first of these Burgundian composers we're going to talk about is Binchois. Gilles de Bin, who was known as Binchois, you can see he lived from 1400 to 1460 approximately. CA, I don't think we've talked about this yet, CA is an abbreviation for the word circa, and circa basically means approximately. So we know he lived from approximately 1400, we don't know the exact date of his birth, to 1460. One of the three most important composers of this generation. We'll talk about the other two in a moment. He wrote movements of masses, individual movements. He wrote motets, and he wrote secular songs. Very influential in Burgundy, and his songs were imitated, copied by many people. If we think about these different terms that we've used for different kinds of music, this may be the first time, no it's not actually, the word chanson was kind of thrown around when we were talking about the troubadours and trouvères, because their songs were collected in books called chansonnières. Chanson is the French word for just song. And in this time, it was any polyphonic setting of a secular poem in French. There's a woodcut, actually, of Bichois in Bouzouin. So we will listen to a piece by Bichois in class if we have time. But he was a very influential Burgundian composer of the time. Wasn't the most influential, though. The most influential Burgundian composer was Guillaume de Fay, William of Fay. He was born circa approximately 1397, lived until 1474, so a very long life considering the time. Absolutely the most famous composer to come out of continental Europe in the first half of the Renaissance. He traveled while he was from Burgundy. He spent time serving in southern France and in Italy. So, as we were talking about in class on Friday, this enabled him to hear music from all over Europe and kind of be influenced, absorb all of these stylistic traits. So his style could be considered to be a truly international style of music. The first part of the Renaissance, as we've talked about, is one of the first times that an international style begins to develop. And you see his output, very substantial. 6 complete masses, these are settings of the Mass Ordinary, 35 other settings of specific Mass movements, 4 Magnificats, 60 hymns, 24 motets, 34 chant melodies, 60 rondeaux. If you remember the rondeau, it's a form, one of the fixed form French poems, and many other secular songs. Probably his most famous piece was actually a secular song he wrote, a C'est la face palais. It is a ballad, a ballade in French. We will listen to it in class. It's functionally a love song. It blended things that he had learned in his travels. It has kind of some English elements, if you think about some of the music we were talking about before, where the voices are of equal importance. The tenor is original composition, originally composed tenor, short phrases, consonant harmony, we talked about that, where vertically the music is consonant. So the composers are obviously thinking about how it sounds chordally as well as how each individual voice sounds. Thirds, sixths, and triads, although they hadn't invented the term triad yet, but remember we talked about in class today. Thirds and sixths in the Renaissance began to be viewed as consonant intervals. In the Middle Ages, thirds and sixths were dissonances, which could only be used as you move to the perfect intervals, your unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves. In the Renaissance, thirds and sixths began to be thought of as consonant. So the harmonies we're seeing coming out of here now have favor thirds and sixths, which functionally means we're going to have triads, even though, as I said, they haven't invented the term yet. The form, it's a freely composed form, almost through composed. It's not locked into one of these preset forms. So we will listen to that ballade. Something else that came out of Burgundy at this time was the faux bourdon, which is essentially the fa burden. If you think of the fa burden, the improvised polyphony in England, the faux bourdon is essentially the same thing. He would write out the contus in the tenor that would primarily move in parallel sixths, and then you would improvise a third voice, a perfect fourth below the contus, essentially producing a whole stream of first inversion sounding chords. They would improvise it at the time to set some of the simpler chants. So it's semi-improvised polyphony. You actually have 2 voices written out and a third improvised, as opposed to the fa burden where you have 1 voice written out and 2 voices improvised at locked intervals. So this takes us to kind of jumping a bit, but at this time, the polyphonic Mass. Now, up until 1420, the polyphonic, the Mass had never been set as a complete whole by one composer. It was always, composer would write an individual Mass movement, compose a Kyrie, might compose a Credo, and in the service, they would select whatever Mass movements they wanted, and they would have the Catholic Mass like that, where they had these different movements from these different composers. The only exception to this, of course, was Machaut's Notre Dame Mass. He was the first composer to set the complete Mass ordinary, and he was also the last composer to do it for quite a number of decades until we get in the 1420s. So, during the 1400s, composers began to take on the challenge, I want to set the Mass as a whole. I'm going to set the complete Mass ordinary. The leading composers along this, John Dunstable, as we talked about, and also Lionel Power, who was a contemporary of Dunstable's, two English composers who started setting complete Mass ordinaries into something in which we'll call a Mass cycle. Now, pay attention to this closely. There will be stuff about this on the exam and homework assignments. Essentially, in a Mass cycle, there are different ways that you can make the movements relate to each other. Any of the singers, if you have been studying any song cycles, the songs in a song cycle are all related somehow. In their case, they may be related by subject, they may be related by a specific melodic fragment or melody, they may be related because they're all poems by the same poet. Well, Mass cycles are kind of the same way. So, the first way we're going to talk about setting a complete Mass ordinary is a plain song Mass. Each movement in a plain song Mass is based on an existing text, an existing chant for that text. I'm going to write a Kyrie. Okay, I'm going to pick a Kyrie, the Kyrie chant, Gregorian chant that I like, and I'm going to compose my Kyrie based on that. Okay, now I'm going to write a Gloria. I'm going to pick a pre-existing chant for my Gloria. Not related musically, because each movement is set on a different chant that you would pick. So, kind of thematically related, because each chant, each movement, you're composing the complete thing, but each movement is based on a pre-existing chant. A motto Mass has a much more noticeable musical connection between the movements, because each movement starts with the same motive, the same melodic motive. Every movement's going to start with the same fragment of melody, so this musically ties the entire Mass together. Another way that was probably the most popular kind of Mass, most popular way to write a Mass, I should say, was the cantus firmus Mass, sometimes called a tenor Mass. Now, in this case, they would select a tenor, they would select a cantus, and they would use the same tenor in every movement of the Mass. Every movement will be different, because every movement is freely composed, but they all start with the same cantus firmus, the same pre-selected tenor. Started in England with Dunstable and Power, and eventually became the most written form of Mass cycle. And then the cantus firmus imitation Mass. Now in this case, we're going to take a tenor from a secular song, from a polyphonic chanson, and we're going to use that as the cantus firmus. And then frequently, imitation Mass, we're also going to borrow some other musical elements from this song, from this secular song. The Mass names usually came from the borrowed melody. The Armed Man was a secular song which most of the major composers, and we will listen to it in class, most of the major composers like that song as an undeniably popular secular song, and they used this song as the tenor for their cantus firmus imitation Masses. By this time, the four-voice texture has replaced the three-voice texture for the majority of composers. They've added a part below the tenor. This part they add below the tenor is called the contratenor bassus, or low contratenor. Later, we dropped the first word from that, and we simply called it the bassus, or the bass. So now, we have a four-part texture, and we have a bass below the tenor. The bass serving as the harmonic foundation. Everything is really leading in the direction of composers conceiving of things more vertically, more chordally. So the highest voice, the superior, meaning highest, is today known as the soprano. Contratenor altus, meaning high contratenor, later just became known as the altus, today alto of course, the tenor, and the contratenor bassus, known today as the bass. So all this stuff about Dufay and about mass cycles and about four-voice textures and all that leads us to one of the most important works of the first half of the Renaissance, Dufay's Missa c'est la face et palais, his mass on the tenor from his own secular song. It's the first complete mass that used this secular tune for the cantus in all the movements. Tenor from his own ballad, as I said. Very popular. A very, very popular thing. And so basically, from this moving forward, for about the next 100 years, give or take, almost every composer who attempted a mass cycle would use some kind of a secular tune as the basis of their mass cycle. So, because he borrows from his own ballade, his own polyphonic secular song, he borrows more than just the tenor, but he borrows other musical elements. That makes this an imitation mass as well. Every voice has a specific role. And we're going to break this song down, this mass down, quite a bit in class. We'll listen to it and really study it a little bit. It's the original tenor melody. We'll, of course, look at this in class. And then here is the Gloria from that, but we will break that down. So, the polyphonic mass. Absolutely the most prestigious genre of this time. The idea of setting a complete mass ordinary, well, it didn't come around until around 1420. It's existed now for the last 500 years. The idea of a composer wanting to set a complete mass ordinary, composers still do it today. Different kinds of masses, some mass propers, of course, requiems, still composers who write requiems. I mean, heck, Andrew Lloyd Webber, the guy who wrote Phantom of the Opera and Cats and those other musicals, he actually wrote a requiem mass. But this idea of setting a complete mass ordinary is very popular. Now, the role of it has changed. So today, these masses are actually performed in concert, as concert music. I mean, heck, right up the road, the Philadelphia Orchestra, over the last 5 years, has been going through a whole series of masses, several requiems. They've done the Brahms German Requiem, they've performed the Fauré Requiem, the Verdi Requiem. Last season, I believe, they played Leonard Bernstein's Mass. And this year, they're actually doing the Mozart Requiem. So, they're now viewed more as concert music, as the role of music in the Catholic Church has changed from the original simply telling of the liturgy. Elements of this idea, the way music was composed during this time, actually remain very important for the next 400 years or so. The idea of the structure and the intent rhythmic interest that French music generated. Italian music, even today we think of Italian music as being so based in lyrical melodies. And if you think back even to the great Italian opera composers of the 1800s, Verdi, Puccini, Bellini, it's all based in this idea of beautiful lyrical melodies. English music since then has, in general, thought of as the counterpoint, being very consonant and moving very smoothly, not a lot of jarring motion in English counterpoint. So these are concepts, national concepts, that really remain all the way through the 1800s, and even today we think about them to some degree. That is Chapter 8. You have the homework assignment for Chapter 8, so you need to complete that, turn that in next class, and then in the next class we will spend a lot of time breaking down, we'll listen to a carol, we'll do a lot of work on Dufay's music, as well as